In 1853, a chapel wedding photograph captured something that would haunt a Mississippi plantation for over 170 years. A 14-year-old bride in white stands beside a preacher whose smile conceals a devastating truth. Behind the ceremony lies a systematic program of forced breeding, falsified records, and a conspiracy of silence that extended from the pulpit to the plantation house. When the photograph surfaced in a university archive in 2019, it opened a wound that generations had tried to heal, and revealed that some secrets refuse to stay buried. 170 years ago, in an isolated plantation chapel in northern Mississippi, church records and daguerreotype photographs documented a wedding ceremony so disturbing that it disappeared from official histories. The bride, a 14-year-old enslaved girl, vanished from all subsequent records, but not from the oral memory of her descendants. Her absence left scars that marked generations with a silent trauma only now beginning to surface. The preacher who officiated, Reverend Josiah Whitmore, maintained immaculate records of every baptism, funeral, and marriage performed in that chapel. Yet his ledger contains a gap of exactly 3 pages for the year 1853, pages that were carefully removed and never replaced. The photograph that survived tells a different story than the one he wanted remembered. Before we continue, subscribe and hit the notification bell. Here we unearth secrets buried by official history and give voice to what was silenced. Chapter 1. The photograph that wouldn't fade. The daguerreotype arrived at the University of Mississippi's special collections in a water-damaged trunk donated by the Whitmore family estate in March 2019. Among prayer books and sermon notes, graduate student Rebecca Chen discovered what appeared to be a routine wedding photograph from 1853. The image quality was remarkable for its age. The bride's white dress caught the light, the preacher's hands rested on a Bible, and a small gathering of witnesses stood in the background. But something about the photograph disturbed Chen immediately. The bride looked impossibly young, her eyes fixed somewhere beyond the camera with an expression that wasn't joy or nervousness, but something closer to resignation. The witnesses in the background, all black faces, wore expressions that didn't match the supposed celebration. And the preacher's smile seemed rehearsed, performed for the camera rather than born of genuine happiness. Chen brought the photograph to Dr. Marcus Williams, a historian specializing in antebellum Mississippi. Williams recognized the chapel immediately. It belonged to the Thornhill Plantation, one of the largest cotton operations in the region. But when he searched for marriage records from 1853, he found nothing. No bride's name, no groom, no witnesses listed. The chapel's meticulously kept ledger simply skipped from February to June of that year, as if those months had never existed. The absence was too deliberate to be accidental. Someone had removed those pages with surgical precision, leaving clean cuts in the binding where 3 sheets of paper once resided. The surviving pages before and after showed no water damage, no fire marks, nothing that would explain why only those specific months had vanished. Williams knew immediately that he was looking at an intentional erasure and that the photograph had survived precisely because someone never knew it existed. Over the following weeks, Williams and Chen began tracing the Thornhill Plantation's history through county records, tax documents, and surviving correspondence. What emerged was a portrait of a prosperous operation that relied on over 200 enslaved people to maintain its cotton production. The plantation owner, Colonel Marcus Thornhill, maintained a reputation as a relatively humane slaveholder by the standards of his time. He allowed families to remain together, permitted religious services, and rarely used the whip. But that reputation, Williams discovered, masked something far darker. In a letter dated 1852, found in the archives of a neighboring plantation, Colonel Thornhill discussed his breeding program, with unusual candor. He wrote of selecting young girls when they reached physical maturity and pairing them with men he deemed to have valuable traits: strength, intelligence, submissiveness. He mentioned consulting with Reverend Whitmore about the moral implications and receiving assurances that such arrangements, when blessed by marriage, fell within acceptable Christian practice. The letter ended with a chilling observation. "The Reverend has agreed to perform the ceremonies discreetly. We must maintain the appearance of propriety even when pursuing necessary economic measures." Williams realized that the photograph wasn't documenting a wedding in any meaningful sense. It was documenting the formalization of forced breeding, sanctified by religious authority and captured on film as if it were a normal union. The 14-year-old girl in white was being married off to produce children who would increase the plantation's human property. And Reverend Whitmore, the man whose sermons allegedly spoke of Christian mercy and divine love, had become an active participant in the system. The question that haunted Williams as he stared at that photograph was simple but devastating. How many other ceremonies had Whitmore performed? How many other girls had stood where this one stood, dressed in white, smiling for posterity while their futures were stolen? And why had this particular photograph survived when all the records had been destroyed? The answers, Williams suspected, lay not in official documents, but in the stories that had been passed down through generations of descendants, stories that had been dismissed as exaggerations or family legends, but might contain the only truth that remained. He began searching for anyone who could trace their lineage back to the Thornhill plantation, knowing that somewhere in the oral histories of those families lay the pieces of a story that official history had tried to erase. Chapter 2. The Preacher's Ledger. Reverend Josiah Whitmore arrived at Thornhill Plantation in 1847 with impeccable credentials from a seminary in Charleston. His letters of recommendation praised his theological knowledge, his eloquent preaching, and his understanding of the peculiar institution as a divine ordering of society. Colonel Thornhill hired him not just as a spiritual leader, but as a moral authority who could sanctify the plantation's operations with religious legitimacy. The chapel Whitmore oversaw was a modest wooden structure that seated perhaps 80 people. Services were segregated. White family members and overseers occupied the front pews, while enslaved people stood in the back or sat on the floor. Whitmore preached obedience, patience, and the promise of rewards in the afterlife. His sermons, according to surviving notes, rarely mentioned liberation or justice in this world. Heaven was the compensation for earthly suffering, and questioning one's station was questioning God's plan. But Whitmore's role extended far beyond Sunday sermons. He maintained the chapel's official records, documenting every significant event in the lives of both the plantation's white family and its enslaved population. Births, deaths, marriages, all passed through his careful handwriting into the leather-bound ledger he kept locked in his office. For years, historians assumed these records were lost to time, destroyed in the chaos of the Civil War, or simply discarded when the plantation was abandoned. Dr. Williams discovered otherwise in a lawsuit filed in 1891, nearly 3 decades after the war ended. A freedman named Isaiah Thornhill, who had taken the plantation's name as his own surname, sued the estate of Reverend Whitmore's son, claiming that records proving his parentage and rightful inheritance had been deliberately destroyed. The lawsuit went nowhere. The judge ruled that even if such records existed, they held no legal weight. But the court documents revealed that Whitmore's ledger had survived intact and was being held by his descendants. Williams spent 6 months negotiating access to that ledger, finally reaching an agreement with Whitmore's great-great-grandson, a retired schoolteacher in Tennessee who seemed genuinely disturbed by what his ancestor might have done. When the ledger arrived at Williams' office, carefully packaged and insured, He spent an entire evening alone with it before calling Rebecca Chen. The ledger was exactly as Isaiah Thornhill had described in his lawsuit, meticulously maintained, with entries in perfect chronological order spanning from 1847 to 1865, except for those 3 missing pages in 1853. The cuts were so clean that Williams could see where the razor had sliced through the binding, removing the pages without damaging the surrounding entries. Whoever had destroyed those records had done so with surgical precision and clear intent. But Whitmore had made a mistake. On the page immediately following the gap, dated June 15, 1853, there was a baptism entry for an infant named Sarah, daughter of Rose, property of Col Thornhill. The entry was routine except for one detail. Whitmore had written and then crossed out another word before Rose. Williams held the page up to strong light and could just make out the crossed-out text, Bride. Rose, Bride. The 14-year-old girl in the photograph had a name. Williams began searching for every mention of Rose in the ledger. She appeared first in 1839 as a birth. Rose, daughter of Martha and Jacob, born January 12th. She would have been 14 in 1853, exactly as the photograph suggested. After the wedding entry that had been removed, she appeared again in 1854 with the birth of her first child, Sarah, then another child in 1856, twins in 1858, and a final child in 1860. 5 children in 7 years, each carefully recorded, each listed as property of Col Thornhill. There was no mention of a husband, no father listed for any of the children, just Rose and her offspring, appearing in the ledger like products of a manufacturing process rather than a family. Williams found the groom's identity by accident in a property inventory from 1865 when the plantation was being liquidated. Among the lists of tools, furniture, and remaining enslaved people was an entry for Samuel, age 35, field hand, husband to Rose, deceased. Rose had died sometime in 1860, shortly after her last child was born. She was 21 years old. Samuel was listed as 42 in the inventory, meaning he had been 29 when he married the 14-year-old Rose. Not a young man paired with a young woman, but a deliberate choice by Colonel Thornhill to match a girl barely into adolescence with a man old enough to be her father. The age gap alone suggested that this was never about love or even the pretense of normal marriage. This was breeding stock being paired for optimal production. Whitmore had performed the ceremony. Whitmore had blessed the union. Whitmore had stood in that chapel and declared before God and witnesses that this was a sacred bond. And then, when the war ended and the moral reckoning began, Whitmore or someone in his family had carefully removed the evidence, leaving only the photograph that no one knew existed. Now, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this story. I want to know how far these silenced accounts reach. Chapter 3. The Breeding Records. As Dr. Williams dug deeper into the Thornhill Plantation's archives, a pattern emerged that transformed his understanding of what he was investigating. This wasn't an isolated incident of one forced marriage. It was a systematic program that Colonel Thornhill had operated for over a decade, documented in his personal correspondence with a chilling combination of business calculation and moral justification. In letters to other plantation owners, Thornhill discussed his methodology with the detachment of a livestock breeder. He wrote about selecting girls between ages 13 and 15, when they showed signs of physical maturity, but before they could form attachments that might complicate the pairings he arranged. He mentioned consulting with a doctor in Natchez about optimal breeding ages and received advice that younger mothers produced more children over their fertile years, maximizing long-term returns. Thornhill kept a separate ledger, discovered in a private collection purchased by the Mississippi Department of Archives in 2021, that tracked these pairings with disturbing precision. Each entry listed the girl's name, age, physical characteristics, and the man selected for her. Then came columns tracking pregnancies, births, infant survival rates, and the eventual market value of the children produced. Rose appeared in this ledger as entry number 7, paired with Samuel in March 1853, with a projected value increase of $4,000 over 10 years based on expected births. The ledger revealed 15 such pairings between 1848 and 1860. The girls ranged from age 12 to 16. The men were typically in their late 20s to early 40s, chosen for physical strength, intelligence, or skills that Thornhill wanted to see passed to the next generation. Not one of the marriages listed a bride older than 17. Not one showed any indication that the couples had chosen each other. But the most disturbing discovery was how thoroughly Thornhill had covered his tracks legally and morally. Every pairing was formalized as a marriage, blessed by Reverend Whitmore in the Plantation Chapel, complete with witnesses and ceremonial details that gave the appearance of legitimacy. Thornhill wrote to a fellow planter explaining his reasoning. The ceremony provides legal documentation of paternity, ensures the children's status as legitimate property, and satisfies the moral objections of our more squeamish neighbors. The Reverend has been invaluable in providing this service. Whitmore, in other words, wasn't just a passive participant, he was an essential partner in making the program appear respectable. His religious authority transformed forced breeding into holy matrimony. His careful record-keeping created the legal documentation Thornhill needed to claim ownership of the children produced, and his sermons about obedience and divine order provided the ideological justification that kept enslaved people from open rebellion. Williams found evidence of Whitmore's compensation in Thornhill's account books. The preacher received $500 annually, far more than a typical plantation minister, plus a percentage of the increased property value generated by the children born from his sanctioned marriages. Whitmore had a direct financial stake in the breeding program's success. The account books also revealed something else. Not all the girls survived their assigned roles. 3 of the 15 died in childbirth or from complications shortly after. Their deaths were recorded in Whitmore's ledger, with the same dispassionate notation used for any other property loss: the date, the cause, and the economic impact. One entry. For a girl named Dinah, who died in 1854 at age 15, included a note, "Unfortunate loss before full potential realized. Will pair sister Mary as replacement." Mary, Dinah's 13-year-old sister, appeared in the breeding ledger 6 months later, matched with the same man who had been assigned to Dinah. Williams sat with these documents for days, trying to comprehend the mindset that could treat human beings with such calculated cruelty while maintaining the facade of Christian morality. Thornhill attended church every Sunday. Whitmore led prayers and sang hymns. The white families of the plantation celebrated Christmas and Easter, baptized their children, and mourned their dead with elaborate funerals, all while operating a system that treated enslaved girls as breeding stock and their children as inventory. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain this duality was staggering. But Williams knew from his research that it wasn't unusual. Throughout the antebellum South, countless plantation owners operated similar programs, blessed by ministers who saw no contradiction between Christian love and human bondage. The documentation was usually destroyed after the war, either by the plantation owners themselves or by descendants eager to sanitize family histories. What made Thornhill's case unusual was how much evidence survived: the photograph, the ledgers, the correspondence. Someone in the family had kept these records. perhaps as a kind of proof, perhaps out of simple organizational habit. And now, more than a century and a half later, they were revealing a truth that official histories had buried. Williams knew that finding Rose's descendants was crucial. Somewhere, people were living who carried her DNA, who might have family stories about her, who deserved to know the truth about where they came from. But finding them would require tracing family lines through a period when enslaved people weren't always recorded, when families were deliberately separated, when names were changed or lost entirely. It would take months of genealogical detective work, DNA testing, and careful outreach to communities that had every reason to distrust academic researchers asking about painful histories. But Williams was committed. Rose deserved to have her story told, and her descendants deserved to know that the silence that had surrounded her life was finally breaking. Chapter 4. The witness who remembered the breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In August 2020, a woman named Loretta Hayes contacted Williams after seeing a brief article about his research in a regional history journal. Hayes, a retired nurse living in Memphis, said her grandmother had told stories about the Thornhill Plantation, where her own grandmother had been enslaved. The stories included details about forced marriages and a preacher who blessed unions that everyone knew weren't real marriages at all. Williams drove to Memphis the following week to meet Hayes at her home. She was 78, sharp-minded, with a collection of family documents and photographs that spanned generations. Among them was a Bible that had belonged to her great-great-grandmother, a woman named Martha, who had been enslaved at Thornhill until the war ended. Inside the Bible's front cover, written in careful script, was a family tree. Martha's daughter was listed as Rose, born 1839, died 1860. Under Rose's name were 5 children: Sarah, Jacob, twins Mary and Martha, and Samuel Jr. The Bible's margins contained handwritten notes, added over decades by different family members, preserving stories that might otherwise have been lost. One note, written in the 1920s by Martha's granddaughter, read, "Grandmother Martha said Rose was married too young to a man she didn't choose. The preacher made it look right, but it wasn't right. Rose never smiled after that day. She died having her last baby, and Grandmother Martha said Rose was glad to go." Hayes shared what her own grandmother had told her in the 1960s, stories passed down through 3 generations about life on the plantation. The forced marriages weren't hidden from the enslaved community. Everyone knew what was happening, even if the white family pretended otherwise. The girls chosen for the program were watched carefully by their mothers and aunts, who tried to prepare them for what was coming but couldn't stop it. Martha had been Rose's mother. She had watched her 14-year-old daughter being married to a man more than twice her age. She had attended the ceremony in the chapel, standing in the back with the other enslaved witnesses, and she had seen Reverend Whitmore smile and bless the union as if it were a normal wedding. Years later, Martha told her own children that the worst part wasn't the ceremony itself, but the way Whitmore made it seem holy, as if God approved of what was being done to Rose. Hayes pulled out another document, a photograph from the 1890s showing an elderly black woman standing in front of a small wooden church. On the back, someone had written, "Martha, age 85, at the new chapel she helped build." The church was in a freedmen's community established after the war, about 20 miles from where Thornhill Plantation had stood. Martha had lived to see emancipation, had helped build a church where black families could marry by choice, and had raised several of Rose's children after her death. Williams asked Hayes if she would be willing to do a DNA test to confirm the connection to Rose. Hayes agreed immediately, saying she had been waiting for someone to finally ask the right questions about her family's history. The test results came back 6 weeks later, confirming that Hayes was a direct descendant of Rose through her daughter Sarah. Armed with this confirmation, Williams began reaching out to other potential descendants. He posted notices in local newspapers, contacted churches in the region, and worked with genealogical societies to trace family lines. Over the following year, he identified 47 people who could trace their ancestry directly back to Rose. 47 people living in 12 different states, most of whom had no idea about the specifics of their ancestors' life. Many were initially reluctant to engage with the research. The history of slavery was painful, and some families had deliberately avoided discussing the details of their ancestors' experiences. But as Williams shared what he had discovered, the photograph, the ledgers, the evidence that Rose had existed and that her life mattered, more descendants agreed to participate. In June 2021, Williams organized a gathering at the site where Thornhill Plantation once stood. The plantation house was long gone, destroyed by fire in 1893, but the chapel still stood, abandoned and overgrown but structurally intact. 32 of Rose's descendants attended, along with descendants of other enslaved people who had lived on the plantation. They held a memorial service in that chapel, speaking Rose's name aloud in the same space where she had been forced into marriage at age 14. A local minister, a black woman descended from enslaved people herself, led prayers that focused not on forgiveness but on witness, on making sure that what had been done to Rose was acknowledged and remembered. Hayes spoke about her great-great-grandmother Martha, about the strength it took to survive watching your daughter being treated as property, about the resilience required to rebuild a life after emancipation. She read from Martha's Bible, from those margin notes that preserved stories the official records tried to erase. Williams presented each descendant with a copy of the photograph, Rose in her white dress, her eyes looking beyond the camera. He also gave them copies of the breeding ledger entry that documented her as property and the chapel record that listed her children's births. Evidence of both her dehumanization and her humanity, preserved in documents that someone had tried to destroy but had failed to eliminate completely. The gathering ended with a resolution to create a permanent memorial at the site, listing the names of all 15 girls who had been forced into marriages as part of Thornhill's breeding program. To make sure that their names, Rose, Dinah, Mary, and 12 others, would be remembered, spoken aloud, and never dismissed as unfortunate but inevitable aspects of a difficult historical period. If this story has gripped you, leave a like. It helps Rose's story reach more people. Chapter 5. The Doctor's Confession. While working with Rose's descendants, Williams received an anonymous package in October 2021. Inside was a journal belonging to Dr. Henry Ashford, the physician who had consulted with Colonel Thornhill about the breeding program. The journal had been in the possession of Ashford's descendants for over a century and a half. Hidden in an attic trunk with other family papers, the person who sent it included a note. "My family needs to stop hiding what he did." Dr. Ashford's journal entries from 1851 to 1863 provided a medical perspective on the program that made the horror even more explicit. He wrote about examining girls as young as 12 to determine if they were physically ready for pregnancy. He described advising Thornhill on nutrition and rest periods to maximize reproductive success, and in later entries he expressed growing doubts about his involvement, though he never took action to stop what was happening. An entry from April 1853, just weeks after Rose's marriage, recorded Ashford's examination of her following her wedding. He noted that she appeared frightened but physically sound, assessed her likely fertility based on family history, and predicted she would produce at least 4 viable offspring over the next decade. He wrote this in the same clinical tone he might use to discuss breeding horses or cattle. But by 1858, Ashford's tone had changed. An entry from November of that year, after attending Dinah's death in childbirth, showed a man beginning to confront what he had been part of. "She was 15 years old. I examined her a year ago and declared her fit for breeding. Now she is dead, her child dead with her, and I wonder if I am a physician or a monster. Thornhill paid me well for my expertise, but what expertise was this? I helped him calculate which girls would survive pregnancy and which men would produce strong children. I treated human beings as livestock and called it science. The journal revealed that Ashford tried once to convince Thornhill to stop the program. In early 1859, he argued that forcing young girls into pregnancy carried significant health risks and that the moral implications were troubling. Thornhill's response, recorded in detail, was chilling. "My dear doctor, morality is the luxury of those who can afford it. I have a plantation to maintain, debts to pay, and a legacy to preserve. These girls are property, and property exists to generate value. Your role is to keep them alive and productive, not to philosophize about right and wrong." Ashford continued participating in the program until the war made it impossible to maintain. His final entry about the breeding program, dated March 1862, noted that with Union forces approaching and many enslaved people fleeing to freedom, the system was collapsing. The great lie is ending, not from moral awakening but from military defeat. I wonder if that is always how evil ends. Not because people choose righteousness, but because circumstances force their hand. After the war, Ashford moved to Texas and practiced medicine until his death in 1889. His journal entries from those later years showed a man haunted by what he had done, writing repeatedly about the girls he had examined, the children he had delivered, and the knowledge that he had been complicit in a system that treated human beings as breeding stock. But he never publicly acknowledged his role, never testified against Thornhill or Whitmore, never took any action that might have brought accountability. Williams found confirmation of Ashford's involvement in Thornhill's account books, which listed regular payments for medical consultations regarding property. The amounts were substantial, enough to suggest that Ashford's income depended significantly on the breeding program's success. The journal also contained information about the other 14 girls in the program. Ashford recorded examining all of them, noting their ages, physical conditions, and reproductive potential. He documented pregnancies, births, complications, and deaths with the same clinical detachment he used for Rose. Reading these entries, Williams could trace the entire operation: who was paired with whom, which pregnancies were successful, which girls survived their assigned roles. 3 of the girls died before age 20. All 15 bore children, with the number ranging from 2 to 7. The children themselves, according to Thornhill's property ledgers, were valued collectively at over $60,000 by 1860, an enormous sum representing human beings treated as financial instruments. Ashford's journal included sketches and diagrams showing the layout of the plantation slave quarters, noting which cabins were assigned to which couples, and how the spacing was designed to prevent men from leaving their assigned partners. The level of control was total. These weren't marriages, but managed breeding operations where every variable was calculated and monitored. Williams shared the journal with Rose's descendants, asking if they wanted the medical details of their ancestors' life made public. The response was mixed. Some felt that exposing every aspect of the dehumanization was necessary to fully acknowledge what had been done. Others found the clinical nature of Ashford's observations deeply painful and questioned whether sharing such details served any purpose beyond voyeuristic horror. The decision was made to include the journal in the historical record, but to focus public presentation on the humanity of the girls involved, rather than the medical procedures they endured. Rose was not primarily a breeding subject. She was a daughter, a mother, a woman whose life had value beyond her reproductive capacity. The documents that treated her as livestock were evidence of a crime, not the full story of who she was. Williams arranged for the journal to be archived at the University of Mississippi, with access restricted to researchers and descendants. He also worked with the anonymous donor to create a scholarship fund in Dr. Ashford's name. not to honor him, but to acknowledge the debt his descendants owed to the communities harmed by his actions. The scholarship would fund medical education for descendants of enslaved people, a small but concrete attempt to redirect resources toward repair. Chapter 6. The Preacher's Descendants. In January 2022, Williams received a letter from Thomas Whitmore, the retired schoolteacher who had provided access to his ancestors' ledger. Thomas wrote that he had been conducting his own research into his family history and had discovered something that disturbed him deeply. Evidence that Reverend Josiah Whitmore had fathered children with at least 2 of the enslaved women on Thornhill Plantation, including possible evidence that he might have been the biological father of one of Rose's children. Thomas had taken a DNA test as part of his research and had been matched with several people who traced their ancestry to Thornhill Plantation. The genetic connections were unmistakable. His great-great-grandfather had biological descendants among the very people he had helped keep enslaved. Williams met with Thomas in Tennessee to examine the evidence. The DNA matches showed connections to descendants of 2 women listed in Whitmore's ledger, Rose and another woman named Elizabeth. The timing of the pregnancies suggested that the children were conceived during the years Whitmore served as the plantation's minister. One of Rose's children, Jacob, born in 1854, showed particularly strong genetic markers consistent with Whitmore's lineage. This discovery added another layer of horror to the story. Whitmore hadn't just officiated forced marriages and blessed a breeding program. He had apparently taken advantage of his position to abuse enslaved women himself. The man who preached about Christian morality and divine order had fathered children with women who had no power to refuse him, then continued baptizing and recording those children as property. Thomas was devastated by the revelation. He shared letters from Whitmore to his wife, written during business trips away from the plantation, in which the preacher expressed concern about maintaining proper spiritual guidance for the colored population and ensuring that moral standards were upheld. The hypocrisy was staggering. Whitmore writing about morality while fathering children through exploitation. Williams reached out to descendants of Elizabeth and to the descendants of Rose who were connected to Jacob. The responses varied. Some were angry, feeling that this revelation made the exploitation even more personal and painful. Others felt it explained family stories about children who looked different, about whispered suspicions that had never been confirmed. Loretta Hayes, Rose's descendant, had a complicated reaction. "Part of me wishes we didn't know this. It's easier to think of Rose being forced by another enslaved man than to know that the preacher who blessed her marriage might have violated her too. But not knowing doesn't make it less true. If Jacob was his son, then my whole family line comes partly from this man who helped enslave us." The DNA evidence wasn't conclusive enough to state with certainty that Whitmore was Jacob's father, but the probability was high. Combined with the documented pattern of white men abusing enslaved women, and Whitmore's position of absolute authority in the plantation's spiritual life, the circumstantial evidence was damning. Thomas made a decision that surprised Williams. He wanted to meet Rose's descendants, acknowledge the harm his ancestor had done, and offer whatever form of repair he could provide. In March 2022, he attended a second gathering at the former plantation site, bringing with him more of Whitmore's papers, including sermon notes that he felt descendants should have access to. Standing before several dozen descendants of people his ancestor had helped enslave, Thomas read a statement. "I cannot undo what Reverend Josiah Whitmore did. I cannot bring back the girls he married off or restore the years they lost, or heal the trauma that passes through generations. But I can stand here and say clearly that what he did was evil. He used his religious authority to sanctify exploitation. He fathered children through abuse of power, and then he carefully destroyed the evidence of his crimes. I'm here to say that his descendants acknowledge this truth and will not hide from it. Thomas announced that he was donating his family's land in Tennessee, 300 acres inherited through the Whitmore line, to a non-profit dedicated to preserving Black history and supporting descendants of enslaved people. He also committed to funding a research project to identify other ministers who had participated in similar programs throughout the South, arguing that Whitmore was likely not unique and that the complicity of religious authorities needed to be thoroughly documented. The gesture wasn't without controversy. Some descendants felt that donating land and funding research, while meaningful, couldn't balance the scales of what had been done. Others appreciated Thomas's willingness to take concrete action and his refusal to defend or minimize his ancestors' behavior. Williams observed that Thomas's decision reflected a growing pattern among descendants of slaveholders, a recognition that silence and privacy around family history perpetuated harm, and that some form of public accountability and material repair was necessary. Not everyone in Thomas's extended family agreed with his choices. Several relatives accused him of betraying family honor and unnecessarily dragging the Whitmore name through the mud. But Thomas remained committed. He worked with Williams to create a traveling exhibit about the chapel wedding photograph and the breeding program it represented, ensuring that Reverend Whitmore's role was clearly documented. The exhibit would tour universities and historical societies throughout the South, presenting evidence of religious complicity in slavery that many institutions had preferred to ignore. The exhibit included the photograph, excerpts from Whitmore's ledger, pages from Ashford's journal, and testimonies from descendants. It also included Thomas's statement of acknowledgement and information about the land donation and research funding. The goal was to make it impossible to discuss antebellum Christianity without confronting the reality of ministers who blessed exploitation and called it holy. Chapter 7. The Children Who Survived. While the focus of Williams' research had been on Rose and the other girls forced into the breeding program, the children produced by that system had their own stories that deserved attention. These children, Rose's 5, and dozens more born to the other 14 girls, grew up knowing they were valued primarily as property, born into a system that measured their worth in dollars and calculated their potential productivity before they could walk. Through genealogical research and outreach to descendants, Williams began piecing together what happened to these children after emancipation. The survival rate was remarkably high compared to many plantations. Thornhill had invested significantly in keeping children alive because they represented his future wealth. But surviving physically didn't mean escaping psychological trauma. Sarah, Rose's oldest daughter, was 10 when the war ended. According to family stories preserved by her descendants, she remembered her mother vividly, the sadness that seemed to follow Rose everywhere, the way she held her children a little too tightly, as if afraid they would be taken away. Sarah told her own children that her mother had died of a broken heart as much as from childbirth complications, that living as she had been forced to live had drained something essential from her. After emancipation, Sarah stayed in Mississippi, working as a domestic servant and later as a laundress. She married a man named Thomas Green in 1870, a genuine marriage by choice this time, and had 3 children. Her descendants included teachers, ministers, farmers, and professionals who spread across the South and eventually to northern cities during the Great Migration. They carried Sarah's stories with them, passed down through generations, though many of the details were softened or omitted to spare younger generations from the full horror. Jacob, the child whose DNA suggested Reverend Whitmore might have been his father, had a different trajectory. He left Mississippi immediately after the war, making his way to Kansas as part of the Exoduster movement. He took the surname Freeman and refused to discuss his origins with anyone, including his own children. According to his granddaughter's testimony, recorded in the 1950s as part of a WPA oral history project, Jacob said only that he had been born at a place he wanted to forget, to people he couldn't forgive, and that he intended to build a life where none of it could touch him again. Jacob established a successful farm in Kansas, married and raised 7 children, but his granddaughter remembered him as a man who couldn't quite settle into happiness, who always seemed to be looking over his shoulder, who woke from nightmares he wouldn't discuss. The trauma of his origins, born from a system that treated his mother as breeding stock, possibly fathered by the man who had blessed her enslavement, followed him even into freedom. The twins, Mary and Martha, named after Rose's mother, stayed together their entire lives. They worked as seamstresses in Memphis after the war, living in adjacent houses, raising their children cooperatively. Their descendants remembered them as fiercely devoted to each other, almost unable to function apart. Psychologists who reviewed their story later suggested that their bond might have been intensified by their shared loss, losing their mother when they were only 2 years old, being raised by their grandmother in circumstances of enslavement. Samuel Jr., Rose's youngest child, born in the pregnancy that killed her, grew up never knowing his mother. His grandmother Martha raised him, but according to family stories, Samuel always felt the absence. He became a minister himself, though his theology was radically different from Reverend Whitmore's. Samuel preached liberation, justice in this world, and the need to confront evil rather than accept it as divine will. He founded 3 churches in Tennessee and Mississippi before his death in 1921, and his sermons, some of which were preserved by his congregation, contain clear references to his family history, the mother who died giving him life, the system that had killed her, and the false Christianity that had blessed it all. Williams worked with descendants to create detailed family trees, showing what happened to Rose's children and their offspring. The trees revealed over 400 living descendants as of 2022, spread across 37 states. Teachers, doctors, lawyers, artists, soldiers, activists, people whose lives demonstrated the potential that the breeding program had tried to reduce to mere property value. But the trees also showed persistent patterns of trauma, higher rates of early death, family separation, and silence about origins appeared across multiple generations. Several descendants shared stories of grandparents or great-grandparents who refused to discuss their past, who changed their names, who moved frequently as if trying to outrun history. Williams coordinated with psychologists specializing in generational trauma to offer support to descendants who wanted help processing what they were learning about their family histories. Many reported experiencing complicated emotions, grief for ancestors they had never known, anger at systems that had treated their families as property, and a strange kind of survivor's guilt. Knowing their existence was the result of exploitation, they couldn't change. A granddaughter of Sarah's line spoke at one of the gatherings. "I exist because my great-great-great-grandmother was forced into pregnancy at 14. Every ancestor between her and me exists because of that violation. How do I hold that? I'm grateful for my life, but my life begins with her stolen childhood." There's no way to feel okay about that. This tension between honoring ancestors' survival and acknowledging the evil system they survived became central to how descendants processed the research. They created their own rituals of remembrance, gathering annually at the plantation site, speaking the names of Rose and the other 14 girls, and celebrating the resilience and resistance of all who survived. Chapter 8. The Legal Aftermath. As Williams's research gained public attention, legal questions emerged about whether descendants were entitled to any form of compensation or reparations for what had been done to their ancestors. The Thornhill estate had been liquidated after the war, But property records showed that descendants of Colonel Thornhill still owned land in Mississippi that had been part of the original plantation. In August 2022, a group of descendants filed a lawsuit against the Thornhill family estate, arguing that the breeding program constituted crimes against humanity and that the value extracted from enslaved people's forced reproduction should be returned to their descendants. The lawsuit faced significant legal hurdles, statutes of limitations, questions of standing, and the reality that 19th-century law had treated enslaved people as property rather than persons with legal rights. The case made its way through federal courts, ultimately being dismissed in early 2024 on procedural grounds. The judge ruled that while the breeding program was morally reprehensible, existing legal frameworks provided no mechanism for compensation more than 150 years after the fact. The decision acknowledged the harm, but concluded that remedy required legislative action rather than judicial intervention. Despite the legal defeat, the lawsuit generated significant attention and prompted several state legislatures to consider reparations programs, specifically addressing forced breeding programs during slavery. Mississippi's legislature commissioned a study in 2023 to identify all documented cases of breeding programs within the state and estimate the economic value extracted from enslaved women's forced reproduction. The study, released in early 2025, identified at least 42 plantations that operated systematic breeding programs between 1830 and 1865. The collective value of children born through these programs, adjusted for inflation, exceeded $2 billion. The study recommended creating a reparations fund specifically for descendants of people subjected to breeding programs, arguing that this particular form of exploitation deserved targeted redress. As of late 2025, the legislative effort remained stalled, facing opposition from those who argued that events from over a century and a half ago shouldn't generate present-day financial obligations. But advocates pointed to the documented intergenerational trauma, the wealth disparities created by slavery, and the moral imperative to acknowledge and repair historical wrongs. The legal and political battles over reparations revealed deep divisions about how to address slavery's legacy. Some argued that acknowledgement and education were sufficient, that modern Americans bore no responsibility for their ancestors' actions. Others maintained that inherited wealth, created through exploitation, created ongoing obligations to those whose ancestors were exploited. Williams observed that these debates often missed the point from descendants' perspective. Many said they weren't primarily motivated by financial compensation. They wanted acknowledgement, apology, and structural changes to prevent similar exploitation in any form. They wanted schools to teach the truth about breeding programs rather than sanitizing slavery's history. They wanted memorials that named victims and perpetrators clearly. They wanted systems to ensure that similar exploitation of vulnerable people couldn't happen today. The Thornhill descendants, those who owned remaining land from the original plantation, were divided in their responses. Some argued that they shouldn't be held responsible for what their ancestors did, that they had inherited property legally and owed nothing. Others, influenced by Thomas Whitmore's example, sought ways to acknowledge harm and provide some form of repair. One branch of the Thornhill family donated 50 acres of land for a memorial park, where a monument now lists the names of all 15 girls subjected to the breeding program. Another branch established a scholarship fund for descendants of people enslaved on the plantation. But these gestures were controversial within the family, with several members arguing that they amounted to admission of guilt and set a dangerous precedent. Williams mediated several meetings between Thornhill descendants and descendants of enslaved people, facilitating conversations that were often difficult and painful. The meetings revealed how differently the two groups had experienced family history. For Thornhill descendants, the plantation was part of a heritage that included both good and bad elements. For descendants of enslaved people, it was the site of trauma that continued to reverberate through generations. These conversations also revealed the complexity of racial identity in cases where white slaveholders had fathered children with enslaved women. Several black families discovered through DNA testing that they shared ancestors with white families who bore the slaveholder's name. These genetic connections created uncomfortable situations where people who had been strangers suddenly found themselves distant relatives connected through exploitation. The legal and political dimensions of the case continued evolving as Williams prepared a comprehensive report documenting not just the Thornhill breeding program, but similar operations throughout the South. His research suggested that forced breeding had been far more systematic and widespread than popular history acknowledged, affecting tens of thousands of enslaved women and producing hundreds of thousands of children valued primarily as property. The report, scheduled for publication by a university press in 2026, aimed to make it impossible to discuss slavery without confronting this aspect of its operation. Williams argued that the breeding programs represented a particular kind of violence, the instrumentalization of reproduction itself, the treatment of motherhood as a productive process rather than a human experience. Chapter 9. Memory and Silence. By early 2025, the investigation into the 1853 chapel wedding photograph had expanded far beyond what Dr. Marcus Williams initially imagined. What began as curiosity about a disturbing image had become a comprehensive documentation of systemic exploitation, revealing how plantations operated breeding programs, how religious authorities sanctified them, how medical professionals enabled them, and how the silence that followed emancipation allowed perpetrators to escape accountability. The memorial at the former Thornhill Plantation site became a pilgrimage destination for descendants and others seeking to confront difficult history. The chapel itself was restored and converted into a museum, documenting the breeding program, displaying the photograph that started everything, pages from the ledgers and journals, and testimonies from descendants. The museum explicitly named perpetrators: Colonel Marcus Thornhill, Reverend Josiah Whitmore, Dr. Henry Ashford, refusing to hide behind euphemisms or sanitized language. Visitor responses to the museum were mixed. Some found it too graphic, arguing that presenting the breeding ledgers and medical records was exploitative. Others felt that anything less than full transparency allowed people to minimize what had happened. The museum's curators, several of whom were descendants of enslaved people from the plantation, maintained that accuracy required discomfort, that if people left feeling disturbed, that was appropriate given what they were learning about. The museum also became a site of controversy when it displayed photographs of the Thornhill, Whitmore, and Ashford families alongside the photographs and names of the people they had exploited. Some argued this was unfair to innocent descendants who bore no responsibility for their ancestors' actions. But the curators maintained that showing perpetrators' faces prevented them from disappearing into abstractions, from becoming nameless figures in a distant past rather than real people who made conscious choices. Educational programs developed around the research brought middle school and high school students to the site, where they learned about slavery in ways that standard textbooks often avoided. Students read Rose's name, learned her age when she was married, saw the breeding ledger that valued her as property. Teachers reported that students struggled with the material, but emerged with deeper understanding of slavery's reality, not as an abstract system, but as specific acts of violence against specific people. The research also influenced how other historical sites addressed slavery. Museums and plantations throughout the South began acknowledging forced breeding programs in their interpretive materials, moving away from sanitized presentations that focused on architecture and gardens, while minimizing the brutality that sustained plantation economies. Williams published his comprehensive study in March 2025, titled The Chapel Secret: Forced Breeding and Religious Complicity in Antebellum Mississippi. The book combined historical research, genealogical tracking, contemporary interviews with descendants, and analysis of systemic exploitation. It became required reading in several university programs and sparked renewed debate about reparations, historical memory, and accountability. Critics argued that Williams's research focused too much on individual perpetrators rather than systemic factors, that naming Thornhill, Whitmore, and Ashford distracted from analyzing the larger economic and legal structures that enabled breeding programs. Williams responded that individual accountability and systemic analysis weren't mutually exclusive, that understanding how specific people made specific choices to exploit specific victims was essential to comprehending how the system functioned. Descendants of Rose and the other 14 girls continued gathering annually at the memorial site. By 2025, the gatherings had grown to include over 200 people from multiple family lines, creating a community connected by shared ancestral trauma and ongoing resilience. They shared stories, supported each other through the psychological impacts of learning difficult truths, and organized advocacy for education and reparations. Loretta Hayes, now 83, remained a central figure in these gatherings. She spoke often about her great-great-grandmother Martha, about the strength required to survive watching your child being exploited, about the resilience needed to rebuild after emancipation. She also spoke about the importance of naming what had happened, of refusing euphemisms and sanitized language. They called it a breeding program like Rose was livestock. They called it marriage like she had a choice. We call it what it was: slavery, exploitation, rape, sanctified by a preacher and recorded by a doctor. Only when we speak that truth clearly can we begin to heal. The photograph that started everything, Rose at age 14 in her white dress, became an iconic image in discussions of slavery's brutality. Reproduced in textbooks, displayed in museums, shared widely online, it confronted viewers with a specific face, a specific victim, making it harder to treat slavery as abstract history. Some descendants found the photograph's circulation painful, feeling that Rose's image was being exploited again, displayed to educate people who might never take action based on what they learned. But others argued that visibility was essential, that keeping Rose's story quiet would dishonor her memory. They pointed out that she had been photographed in the first place to document what was presented as a normal wedding, that reclaiming and recontextualizing that image transformed it from propaganda into testimony. As 2025 continued, the conversation about breeding programs expanded beyond the Thornhill case. Researchers in other states began identifying similar programs, finding ledgers and correspondence that documented systematic exploitation of enslaved women's reproduction. A database was established listing all documented cases, creating a comprehensive record that historians, educators, and advocates could access. The database revealed that breeding programs were concentrated in the Upper South, where declining cotton productivity made enslaved people's reproductive capacity more valuable than their labor. States like Virginia, Maryland, and Kentucky became exporters of enslaved people to the Deep South, with breeding programs ensuring a steady supply. The scale was staggering. Thousands of documented cases, probably tens of thousands that left no records. This research prompted renewed calls for comprehensive reparations programs, addressing not just slavery generally, but specific harms like forced breeding. Advocates argued that descendants of women subjected to breeding programs experienced particular forms of intergenerational trauma that deserved targeted support. Therapy, education funding, community rebuilding.